On behalf of the National Glass Association, thank you for joining us for today's Thirsty Thursday webinar, featuring Chris Beard, Director of Building Products Research at John Burns Research and Consulting. Before we dive in, we have just a couple of updates about other association activities. The NGA Glass Conference, taking place in Isle of Palm, South Carolina, just outside of Charleston, is less than 2 months away. This program contains something for everyone. New professionals, those new to the industry or new to NGA activities, will have plenty of networking, advocacy days preparation, golf and a fun run, plus key content discussions that drive the association's priorities for the year. If you've been wondering, now's the time to check it out. Visit glass.org to review a more detailed program and sign up. March is also for meetings. The BEC conference, one of our largest educational and networking events, is taking place March 3rd to the 5th in Nashville. This event is built with our glazing and installing attendees in mind, with great support from our manufacturers and suppliers through a tabletop display and sponsorship. This event is a must to grow your network. For the second time, Glass Processing Automation Days, or GPAD, will take place immediately following from March 5th to the 6th. GPAD is built with glass fabricators in mind as a means to investigate new and innovative glass fabrication technologies and discover the potential of automation and integration. Hear from subject matter experts on ways to increase your efficiencies, profits, and safety. Topics will include building your sales strategy when launching a new product, avoiding the automation scaries, and many more. We hope we've made it an easy decision for you to spend a few days in Nashville with us soon. Again, visit glass.org, find the events menu, and you can learn more about each of these important activities. Before we begin, I'm now pleased to introduce my colleague, Lori Cowan. Lori is editor of Window & Door magazine. She has 16 years experience in editing trade publications for the construction industry and has been with NGA for nearly 5 years. She'll tell you a bit more about what to expect with today's session. Lori?
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Lori Cowan, and I'm so excited to introduce our speaker for today, Chris Beard. Chris is Building Products Research Director for John Burns Research and Consulting. Chris will be presenting the results and analysis of the inaugural Window and Door Market Survey launched earlier this year in a partnership with John Burns Research and Consulting and Window and Door magazine. The survey gauges the pulse of the residential market and fills a needed gap in the fenestration industry. The quarterly report is a first-of-its-kind index of the residential fenestration market and equips industry participants with valuable information about current and future business conditions to help decision-makers make informed business decisions. We invite all manufacturers of residential fenestration products to participate. Results will be shared on windowanddoor.com and Window and Door Weekly, and will help shape key reports in Window and Door magazine, including the annual Industry Pulse and Top Manufacturers Reports, and more. Please join me in welcoming Chris as he walks us through what's happening in the residential fenestration space right now and what we can expect moving forward.
What I'm going to talk about today, I think it's really important before we get into the survey, before we get into the results of what the manufacturers and installers told us. We want to kind of level set to where we are from a macroeconomic perspective. What does that look like for new construction R&R? How did we get to where we are now, and where are we going to go in the future? Then I will introduce the results of the survey. We'll be publishing that today. That's going to go out to our clients, but I have some initial results this morning that I'm going to be sharing with you. And then finally, what do we think is going to happen with building products through 2026? I know Connor gave an interesting perspective yesterday. He and I chatted afterwards, and I have a little bit different take, but it's also important to recognize that I'm focused on building products as a whole, primarily in the residential space. So John Burns, we are specialized in the residential, not really commercial, but what I'm going to be talking about is really important for residential. So let's think about how we got to where we were. And we like to say the Fed really got behind its curve in its objective to maintain stable inflation. Obviously, the Fed has two mandates, dual mandate in this country: low inflation, maximum employment. And you can really see the Fed through the stimulus that transpired post-COVID really didn't react in time on reacting to inflation. In March of 2021, Jerome Powell said inflation is going to wear off quickly. And then by December of 2022, the core inflation was well above the target rate of 2%, really putting the Fed in a bind where they had to act quickly. And because of that, inflation has come up, and we had the largest rate cycle hike in generations. But headline inflation is coming down. That's good news. But core inflation does remain elevated. And that's important as we think about the macroeconomic backdrop and what that means for our industry. So because of this, the Fed had to undergo the most aggressive rate tightening cycle in a generation, really channeling back to the 1980s with Paul Volcker. And that had a direct impact on the Fed funds rate and the 30-year fixed mortgage rate. And interest rates really rose rapidly because of the quick tightening cycle by the Fed. When the Fed does this, recessions generally follow these rate tightening cycles. And you can see this is going back to 1971. You can see where the rate tightening cycle began and how soon a recession came afterwards. We do say that soft landings are possible, but I'd like to point out, and our base case scenarios I'll get to in a second, is that we will achieve a soft landing in this country. But it's important to realize that soft landings are possible, but they're also delayed. So we think there's going to be a higher interest rate environment for a number of years, the next couple of years, and that's going to impact our forecasts as we get into. But soft landings are possible, as you can see. And there's a great quote from Jerome Powell, the Fed chair. Of course, monetary policy does famously work with long and variable lags. Change in financial conditions begin to affect economic activity fairly quickly within a few months. And we certainly did see that. We did see that slowdown in economic activity. We saw a housing-induced recession last year starting in the summer of 2022. We do think that housing is starting to turn the corner, residential housing, single family especially, and I'll get to that in a second. But housing did enter into a recession last quarter. It's interesting, last year, it is interesting to note that housing's contribution to GDP was positive. The GDP announcement last week was positive for the first time in 6 quarters. So we think that housing is starting to come out of that recession that was induced last year. So I did say that we think there's a possibility of a soft landing, and we're cautiously optimistic that's the case. The first reason is the labor situation. Job growth is cooling, but the employment reports that we've been receiving that's been coming out have still been really, really strong. I like to say that recessions don't happen without unemployment. And yes, unemployment does lag when a recession begins, but unemployment is still really strong. Job growth is still positive. And the unemployment rate is really, really low by historical standards. That's a positive. And as we think about the coming generations that I'm going to talk about too, those entering retirement age, the boomers that are getting out of the workforce, there's not going to be enough Gen Xers in the workforce already, millennials coming into the workforce to replace those. So job growth is going to be sluggish, but that's also why we don't think that there's going to be rapid unemployment. The second indicator is the inflation was rapidly induced by supply challenges. We all lived through that in the window and door industry. We're still kind of living through it, although things are mostly improved. But this is an interesting take that the Fed, I believe it was the San Francisco Fed put together. And you can see how they kind of say where inflation comes from. Blue is demand driven. It's people wanting things. They want things, and that's going to drive the price up. The green is just because of supply shortages. Prices were elevated because there was not enough supply in the system. So that natural cause was to drive prices up. We obviously all saw that too. When we look at the rapid inflation that we saw in 2021, 2022, a large chunk of this was driven by supply-driven inflation. So there just wasn't enough supply in the system, capacity wasn't in the system, the resources were strained, and that drove prices up. I'm not implying there's going to be deflation. In fact, I don't think that there is going to be deflation, in fact, particularly for windows and doors. But as we've seen supply chains improve, as we've seen inflation come down, prices are stabilizing and normalizing. So we think that inflation is getting under control. That really makes the Fed's job a lot easier. When mortgage rates increased, they went above, now they're generally around 8%. At a 3% mortgage, 50 million households would qualify for a $400,000 mortgage. Only 26 million of them, so 24 million fewer households will qualify at mortgage rates of a prevailing rate of 7.3%. The rates get above 8%. This is bad news. So 24 million people were just taken out of the system because of the housing cost to income ratio. They didn't qualify for that more expensive mortgage. That's an important backdrop for new construction. Therefore, these homeowners are locked into their homes. We use the term lock-in effect quite a bit. Lock-in effect means you get such a low mortgage rate, you're not going to sell. You're not going to refinance. You're not going to sell to move to a new home because it just doesn't make financial sense. I happen to be one of those locked-in people myself. I'm lucky enough to have a 2.5% mortgage. There is no way in hell I'm going to sell my house and move into a more expensive home. 80% of all outstanding mortgages in the United States right now are below 5%. It just doesn't make sense. So we think that these people are locked in. In another example of this, just 1% of the homes for sale in the US today are occupied homes are up for sale. Again, those homeowners that have existing homes with low mortgage, they're just not selling their house. It doesn't make sense to them. And you can see the historical average is all owner-occupied homes, about 3.4% are up for sale at any given time. Just 1% of them are up for sale right now. So how are builders compensating? Because the new home market is not as bad. We started to see a downturn last summer, but the recovery has actually been pretty good. Builders are a lot more optimistic than they were in the fall and heading into this year. And one of the things that they're doing is the most common use is incentives. Builders are able to buy down the effective mortgage rate, the 30-year mortgage rate. So instead of a homeowner paying the prevailing rate of 7.5%, the builder, who by the way also owns the financing arm of the transaction, says, I'm willing to buy down that rate by 1.5, 2 points, some are even 2.5 points, to bring that 30-year rate down for the full 30-year term to get you into a home. So for that homeowner, that prospective home buyer, where they say they don't want to move into an existing home because they'd be paying the prevailing mortgage rate, they say, okay, I'll go with this builder and I'm going to only be paying 5.5, 6%. I don't have a slide in here about this topic, but one of the things that we did with our New Home Trends Institute is we did consumer research and we said, what is the maximum rate you as a homeowner are willing to accept to move into a new mortgage, into a new home? And it seems to be that magic number is about 5.5%. So consumers said, I'm willing to go up to 5.5% on a 30-year term. Above 5.5%, I'm really not even considering that. Builders are seeing that. They're able to buy down these rates to get to that 5.5%. We think that's going to continue. We get asked quite a bit, is this going to continue now that rates are above 8%? What we're hearing from the builders that we talk to is they are still planning to continue because it's working. The engine is humming. And we see new home sales have been a lot stronger. New home starts coming through the spring, summer, now into the fall seem stronger. And this is really working. So we think builders are going to continue to keep that engine humming. So that's good news for the residential window industry. They're offsetting this affordability because that's coming out of their margins. These rate buy downs are coming out of their margins. But they're able to offset that by scaling down the size of their homes. We've seen the size of homes come down pretty considerably. Builders are building smaller homes, simpler footprints, more predictable designs, and we expect that trend to continue. Another trend that we're seeing is they're using less costly materials. So maybe instead of fiber cement siding, they're using vinyl siding. We're seeing a lot of instances of like a kitchen island being removed. They're also telling us they're removing exterior elements such as fewer windows, fewer accents, things to really add cost to it. They're reducing those to bring that affordability piece down for the homeowner because they are taking that margin hit from the rate buy downs. New homes today are 29% of the home sales availability. So all homes that are for sale, new home sales are 29%. That's the highest ever. You can see the historical average is around 13%. Again, people in existing homes are locked in. They're not selling. New homes are the only game in town. And so let's talk a little bit about the repair and remodeling market. HELOC, home equity lines of credit, are a major driver and a major determinant of large projects. HELOC loan interest rates are really based on the prime rate. The prime rate is based on the Fed funds rate. Each are a little bit higher than the other. And so home equity line of credit rates right now are around 9%, actually a little above 9%. That's double what they were during the pandemic. So for homeowners to think about undertaking large projects and using home equity to finance that, they're thinking twice because what they're ending up paying this year is double what it was last year. And our research shows that about 1 in 4 large remodeling projects, and you can see on the chart here the scale of the amount of spend for a large remodeling project, what percentage of that is financed by cash out refinance or home equity line of credit. You can see these larger scale projects, of which I would call a whole home window replacement a large project that generally needs to be financed. A good chunk of that's come out of HELOC rates. So until those HELOC rates come down, we think there's going to be a little bit of a lockup. It's going to be a little bit stalled on these big ticket remodelings. And this is from a survey that we do every quarter in partnership with Qualified Remodeler. And we ask a good chunk of professional remodeling contractors each quarter, what are they seeing from their homeowner customers? What are they seeing from, and this is a wide range of projects. This could be window replacements, could also be kitchen and bath replacements, upgrades, et cetera. And we're seeing a lot of activity around they're pausing or delaying these large projects until funding comes down, until future date, until finances become more secure, spending less on remodeling projects just because of cost, downgrading project offerings. We're starting to see some product downgrades. So maybe not the most expensive, the nice to have, the have to have, but maybe a step down lower just to kind of save some money on that. And then smaller projects. We're seeing what once was a big project, maybe a whole home window replacement, now being chunked into, I'll do 2 this year, I'll do 2 or 3 next year, and so on and so forth, just so I'm not spending that money all at once, again, because of the cost of capital and financing. Economists do expect the federal funds rate to come down starting mid next year, which is going to bring down HELOC rates. It's going to have a positive impact. We think that for the near term, repair and remodeling is going to be pretty sluggish, especially those big ticket. We think, it's been sluggish this year. I'm sure many of you have noticed that downturn. We think it's going to remain that way really until we start to see a downward movement on interest rates. And leading economists, this chart is really from the Wall Street Journal, kind of shows what economists predict where rates will be by when. The blue boxes is really the area you should focus on. This is what leading economists think with the GDP numbers that we had last week, and we'll see what I believe the Fed is going to pause today when they make their decision. I think CPI is going to remain really elevated for longer. I think it's going to be a little bit before rates start to come down, but nevertheless, we do think that they will come down next year, and that'll have a positive impact on the home and equity line credit. This is another study that we've done. Homes undergo a wave of renovations when they're 20 to 39 years old. We like to call these prime remodeling years. So obviously a home's brand new, nothing needs to be done. It's great. After about 20 years, things start to fall apart. The roof begins to leak, the windows will get drafty, they need replacement. So we did an analysis. The green chart really shows when homes are coming into those prime remodeling years. The green with the circles is where we see the bump in window replacement. You can see, between 20 and 25 years, and then again, another 20 to 25 years after that. So that cycle is relatively predictable. Why is that important? Because we had a housing boom in this country in the early 2000s. You remember before the great financial crisis, the really run up that we had in new home construction, those homes are all 20 years old. They're starting to need to get remodeled. And so we think by 2027, 24 million homes are going to be in what we call these prime remodeling years. We think between now and 2027, there's an additional 2 million homes that are just going to have repairs done to them. These aren't necessarily nice to haves, although there's a good chunk of nice to haves too. There's going to be a lot of need to haves. So thinking about these larger remodeling projects. So once we get through this cyclicality of the high interest rate environment, consumers becoming a little bit more cautious, we think there's tremendous tailwind for the industry on the R&R side. Demographics is also really, really powerful tailwind. We talk about, the retirement age coming in, the boomers getting into retirement age. They're still holding on to their homes. If we look at generations, the 35 to 44-year-olds, so the prime home buying, home ownership years of adulthood, in between 2011 and 2020, there was 1.2 million households, a population, and in the decade of 2021 to 2030, there's 3.9 million. We think that's going to fund an additional 12.7 million households in the 2021 to 2030 years. And that is a huge impact for housing. We've talked about the housing deficit that we think that there is in the US, but this is going to exacerbate that even further. There still is that shortage of housing just from a demographic standpoint. We think as we sit here today, the US has about 1.7 million undersupplied homes. We think there are just 1.7 million housing units too few right now for the existing population. These are households that would like to have a house, just can't find one that would fit their needs. We layer on top of that the 12.7 million new households that are going to be formed before 2030. And then we also think that there's about 500,000 second homes. So people don't think about second homes, but it is a demand driver. People do want to have a house by the beach or the mountains, et cetera. So there's about 500,000 second homes that we think are going to need to come online by 2030. And then 2.3 million homes that are just so dilapidated, they're in such disrepair that you can't do anything with them. They just can't be fixed up. So they need to get torn down and a new house has to be built in that place. And so we think by 2030, there's 17.1 million new homes needed. We're already almost 2024. If we look at the housing starts over the past couple of years and the boom that we did see 21, 22, we think that we haven't deepened that hole, but we also haven't come out of that hole either. So that deficit is still there, and the demographics are really going to drive that need for housing. So this is why when we say, why would anybody take a mortgage out for 7.5%? This is why, because there just is too few housing in the US. So some takeaways from this first section. Fed got behind the curve on its objective to maintain inflation with the most aggressive rate cycle in a generation, but we are cautiously optimistic that we can engineer that soft landing next year after that, and avoid that recession. Interest rates are elevated, and we think they're going to be elevated for longer. They're still climbing. Technically, mortgage interest rates are climbing based on the 10-year Treasury. Buyers qualifying for new mortgages has been cut in half, but builders are responding by offering incentives and also saving some money through smaller homes and using less costly materials. And HELOC interest rates are continuing to rise, affecting these large remodeling projects. We do think that rates are going to come down mid-2024. This does have the potential to unlock financing for these large remodeling projects. But the aging housing stock that is in place is going to need to be replaced, and that's going to continue to be a tailwind for the industry. So now I'd like to talk about the new Window and Door Market Survey that we did in partnership with Window and Door Magazine. This is an exclusive partnership. We approached Window and Door Magazine and the NGA earlier this year and said, there's really not a good survey of qualitative and quantitative manufacturers, suppliers, installers, everybody that touches the residential fenestration industry. So my background is I came immediately before John Burns. I was at Pella Corporation. And I know there's a lot of companies that do market sizing, and we're one of them. We have a position on how big the market is. And there's some positions, the FGIA does a study every year about, what shipments and other organizations. But as far as like the meat of what's next and what's going to coming, how are companies really thinking about the future, it's tough. As you all know, this is a very large privately held industry. Companies don't like to share information. And so I said, if we could just somehow unlock some of the insights and get some of these companies to share, I think it would be really beneficial. So we're super excited to release the first report today, and I'll be sharing the results right now. We talk about measurements of volumes, revenue, lead times, backlogs, and some of the qualitative data that I'm going to discuss. And one thing I do want to stress, those of you that participated, know that you participated. Those that you did not, know that you did not. We certainly welcome you for the next quarter, and I'll have a QR code at the end to sign up to participate. But I want to stress that this is completely anonymous, completely confidential. The companies that respond, we have no visibility to what they said, what input was. We guarantee complete anonymity. So the manufacturers, installers, suppliers, you name it, everybody that responded, we take very seriously that we will not disclose. So we will not disclose that manufacturer said this and manufacturer Y says, oh, because I know that manufacturer X said this, I'm going to react differently. No, we keep this on the up and up, completely confidential, completely anonymous. So when I show these numbers, they are true. They're the actual respondents, but I cannot and would never say like, well, this is what so-and-so said. So I do want to stress this. So if you'd like to participate in the future, find this valuable, would be really thrilled to have you. And you can do that with confidence that your information is never going to be shared. So looking at the third quarter results, window and door companies reported year-over-year volumes growing. On average, total volumes went down by 2%. But 45% of the respondents said that the total volumes grew, shipment volumes. So this is interesting because if we think about last year, we still were in supply chain snarls. We still had tremendous backlogs in the industry. 45% said their volumes were higher this year. We've got some charts on backlogs in a little bit too that I'll show. And revenues were also up, same 45%, maybe not the same, but 45% said their revenues were growing third quarter on average by 7.2%. So what we've seen is those price increases that everybody pushed through in 2021, 2022. I know the price increases were delayed because of the input cost delays. And so it kind of, as the backlogs were worked through, price realization was delayed. But the good news is in the third quarter of this year, companies said that they finally were beginning to realize these price increases, and revenue, year-over-year revenues in the third quarter were up 7.2%. So it's great to see that these price increases that have been pushed through are really starting to take hold. We ask about costs. This was really, really interesting to me. And in fact, we went back and rechecked the numbers. Manufacturers said that input costs, so the raw materials, the raws that went into it, were up 4% year over year. Certainly better than 10, 15% that we saw from craziness with vinyl and glass and aluminum and resins. But what was really shocking is they reported 20% increase in direct labor costs in the third quarter. So that number, I know we hear about wage increases, we hear about getting people into the factory, getting people to the job site to install. That 20% number is absolutely amazing. So we think that continues to be a structural undersupply of labor. I know a lot of different presenters here have talked about the labor shortage that we had. I think we all experienced that in our day-to-day lives, whether you go to a restaurant and they're understaffed, or even in our job functions, how hard it is still to get labor in. The natural consequence of that is obviously pay more. So companies reported 20% increase in direct labor costs. That's shocking. And so this is the backlog question. We asked, are your backlogs higher, lower, about the same? Did they increase or decrease? And the good news is 50% of the respondents said that the backlogs did decrease. Really no surprise. As new orders are coming in, they're starting to slow, so that allows companies to be able to catch up. One of the comments that I saw was it's nice to see a return to more normal seasonality, more sane working conditions versus 3 years of crazy COVID backlogs. So this is good, but yet 20% of the respondents said their backlogs did start to increase in the third quarter. We asked about supply chain. That was obviously a big factor over the past couple of years. And we said, what is the one product that's causing you issues from a manufacturing perspective? What's the one thing that's causing issues that you're still backed up on? The good news is nearly 30% said none. Everything's great. I can get everything when I need it. But 14% said that it was float glass. Another 14% said it's IGUs. Another 14% said it's hardware components. So things like the locking mechanisms or the cranks, vinyl, PVC, 7% screens, adhesives, or other. So the leading response is none, which is great news. That tells us that the supply chains have healed. They're getting back to normal, which allows us to work through these backlogs and get to more sane lead times. Companies are expecting lower revenue in the fourth quarter. So we asked, compared to the third quarter, looking at the fourth quarter, the one we're in right now, how do you think about your revenue expectations? 45% said lower revenue. So this is total respondents, 45% said lower revenue. But lumping everything together, that equates to 2.9% more revenue than the third quarter. So as a whole, companies are still expecting revenue to increase, but the number of respondents are saying that the revenue, 45% is going to be down, but about half saying it's going to be up. So that's good news. A lot of the commentary that we've been seeing is there's finally a return to this normal seasonality. So thinking about the fourth quarter, before COVID, before we had the backlogs, before we had the crazy lead times, you'd see this typical seasonality. Fourth quarter, first quarter be a little bit soft. It's cold outside. Nobody wants to replace their windows. Builder activity starts to slow down a little bit because of the weather. And so what we're seeing is, instead of companies saying, oh my God, I don't have these backlogs anymore, we're starting to hear a lot of, thank God. We're getting back to normal seasonality. We're getting back to normal market conditions. So this is kind of a good pulse check on your business, see where you're saying. We're starting to see a lot more return to seasonality, and we think that's actually good news for the industry. This is what kind of surprised me too. We all knew that we had price increases implemented pretty significantly in 2021 and 2022. And 56% of the respondents said, we're going to hold prices flat. We're not lowering prices, but we're going to keep them where they're at. What really surprised me was the 44% that said, we're actually planning on increasing prices next year. So if you think about, material input costs I showed on the previous slide, up 4%. It's still up. It's not down. We're not seeing broad deflationary in the raw materials, but then you think about that 20% increase in direct labor costs. That's very, very significant. So companies are saying, yeah, we got to get back to price increases. At John Burns, we talk quite a bit with home builders, and we talk quite a bit with large remodeling contractors, and then I work really closely with pro dealers, lumber yards, et cetera. And they came to us at the beginning of the year, and they said, when when are costs going to come down? When are building material costs going to come down? I said, well, they don't typically in this industry. Outside of commodities, we usually remain at levels. We may pause price increases for a little bit, but this just reinforces what I said to them. And we're finally getting the builders to accept and say, yeah, we don't think building material costs are going to come down. Lumber came down this year nicely, but everything else is going to kind of stay at these elevated levels. And this is a cautionary slide for the builders and the dealers to say, like, hey, manufacturers are thinking they're going to have to up prices because input costs are still rising, maybe not to the extent that they were, but labor costs are still going up considerably. So we are definitely not in a deflationary environment. And so you think back about what that has for inflation and the Fed's issue. This all kind of comes together and cumulatively adds up. As you're thinking about your pricing for next year, as you think about how you're going to go to market, we think it's really important to keep this in mind and take this into account. So labor, really expensive. We're seeing a lot of labor hoarding nevertheless. 75% of the companies said they're not planning on making changes to the production workforce. Even though volumes may be down a little bit, even though revenue may not be growing as strongly as expected, only 13% said they're actually planning on reducing production workforce, but another 13% said they're planning on adding to production workforce, and 75% said, you know what, we're gonna see what demand looks like next year. We're gonna hold on to the production workforce. We're not gonna make any changes. A little bit higher numbers for sales and marketing resources. 89% of the companies said they're not gonna make any changes to sales and marketing workforce. None are planning on adding. 11% say there may be some reductions to sales and marketing, but still, kind of cautiously optimistic that things are going to remain the way they've been this year and kind of get through this cycle. So this is an interesting slide. They're going to keep things the way they are. We asked about what is the number one focus area for your company over the next 12 months? What is the one thing that you think you need to focus on now? I know Connor talked a little bit yesterday for those of you that listened in on him, and he said, things that you've kind of put on the back burner and said no to the past couple of years, now might be the opportunity to look at these. And so we thought this was an interesting topic. 21% said production automation. We're going to look at improving efficiencies. No surprise with direct labor up 20% year over year. Also looking at footprint expansion, looking at new production facilities or new markets. Energy efficiency, code changes. I think where the industry is getting forced into that. We tend to lag a little bit behind everybody else, but the industry now with EPA and Energy Star 7.0, that is becoming a focus area. And then another 11% impact resistance, design styles, color changes, new decorative glass or hardware, enhancements for easier installation. I know that's a big focus area for some, and then soundproofing is another focus area. So just kind of interesting to see where the industry is thinking, where the priorities are, really around enhanced production, expanding that footprint, and then energy efficiency code changes. So speaking of code changes, we asked this, and this is kind of a cynical question, and I'm going to give you a cynical response. I've been in this industry for a long time, and I know that when there's a new tax credit coming out and a government incentive for something, there's always thinking that, oh, this is going to be a real tailwind. This industry tends to say, no, we don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. We're going to just continuing on like we kind of always have been. So we said, based on what you know today, how impactful do you think the impact from the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be? 60% said they don't think there's going to be any impact. 20% said somewhat impactful. Another 20% said they're not really sure. This did not surprise me. This surprised some of my colleagues at John Burns when the results came in, who thought, oh, I thought this would be a lot more positive. I will say, though, when you look back, and those of you that lived through this from a manufacturing and maybe from an R&R perspective, when we think back to 2009, 2010, the last time there was substantive tax credits for energy efficiency upgrades, windows disproportionately benefited. The industry saw a noticeable lift in shipments and installs of new window units in the 2009-2010 timeframe. I believe that the IRA, which gives tax credits through 2032, so another 9 years to go, I believe that this is going to have a positive impact on the industry. The industry doesn't seem to quite believe it just yet, but I think that this is something that we need to be thinking top of mind. Homeowners are not yet aware of it, so I think that this is a real opportunity for us as an industry to get ahead of this with contractors and homeowners. So that was the survey. Hope you found it insightful. I will be around afterwards for some questions. But I'm going to briefly touch on our outlook for building products, how we kind of think about the industry over the next few years. So for 2024, first of all, we like to say that we think that there are cyclical events and then structural events. Cyclical is really that next 12-month time period where we say these are the things that are going to happen near term. Structural are kind of the longer term things that are affecting the industry that are going to have a more profound effect, but over a longer time period. For 2024, we think that there's going to be relative strength in R&R on smaller projects. Again, because of home equity line of credits, consumers not wanting to take on additional financing, they're paying for these projects cash. That means smaller projects. We think there's going to be strength in smaller projects just because of the age of homes, the people locked into their homes, they need to do these projects. They're not going to take these large remodeling projects. We think there's going to be muted large product spend over the first half of the year. Once we do start to see some stabilization with interest rates and then even potentially come down, we think towards the back half of the year, that's going to start to unlock some of these larger remodeling projects. We do think that the Inflation Reduction Act will support a broad range of energy efficiency upgrades, but it's going to be a little bit before that takes hold. We see more price-sensitive consumers shifting to these lower-priced projects and then trade up in place, again, because of that lock-in effect. So for new construction next year, here's what we expect. We think that builders are going to drive for affordability. They're going to continue to not take as big of a margin hit on these rate buy-downs by using less costly materials and trending towards smaller, more denser homes and more denser communities. So we think, the one home per quarter acre is probably going to go away. We're going to see a lot more density in some of these master plan communities. We are seeing significant cycle time improvement for single family and multifamily. We think that's pulling forward. So the extended cycle times in new construction that we had because of supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, blowing out by sometimes 6 months or longer, we're starting to see cycle times come in. That means faster shipment of windows. That means faster shipment of installation of windows after ground is broken, the foundation's poured. Builders do continue to take share because of a lack of resale inventory. Again, existing homeowners locked in. Households looking for homes, really the only game that they have is to buy a new home. And we are seeing significant declines. I know that Connor touched on this yesterday. We've been kind of saying this for the past several months. We think multifamily has reached its peak. If you're in multifamily and you think things are great, buckle up, because we think that the number of apartment completions coming online at the end of this year, beginning of next year, plus the financing issues that multifamily developers are having is really going to dry up. I think the term that we use, the pipeline seized up. So we think multifamily is going to be very, very soft for the next couple of years. Going into 2024 and beyond, kind of these structural things, we think they're longer term, all positive tailwinds, all green arrows on this slide. Regions with a combination of older homes, especially those built in the late 90s and early 2000s before that last housing boom, like I said, that's going to really drive a lot of remodeling activity. 80% of the mortgage borrowers are locked in at rates below 5%. There is some regional variation, but those 80% of homeowners, once they see rates stabilizing on the HELOCs or they feel good about where they sit as a homeowner, they're going to start undertaking these larger remodeling projects. They're still not going to move, and they're going to be able to tap into that equity because the average homeowner has, on average, $365,000 of equity in their existing home. That's near an all-time high. We are not anticipating broad price depreciation. We think home values are, for the most part, going to stay. And that's good news because the homeowner still is going to feel that they have value in their home and they're going to be willing to invest in that. From a new construction standpoint, it's going to continue to remain strong. Like I said, there's going to be about 12.7 million new households formed in the 2020s, and that's going to spur growth activity for about 17 million new homes that we think are needed before the 2030 timeframe. That's a huge tailwind for new construction, but also positive implications for R&R. So with that, I will take some questions. If you would like to participate in our next survey, this is a QR code. It goes to a landing page on our website where you can fill out a form, and it's strictly to put in your contact information so that you will be sent the survey when we publish it. We'll release it probably in January for the fourth quarter. As I said before, it's completely anonymous, so there's no way that we can track back any of your answers. So I think you saw the results, and I think we're hoping that these results get you thinking a little bit and encourage you to participate. So with that, thank you. I'll be happy to take some questions if anybody has any.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. We've had a lot of activity in the chat and the Q&A bar. I will leave this screen up so attendees can see the QR code and your contact information while we visit. So Lori, I'll let you take it from here.
Sure, sounds great. Thank you so much for that presentation, and thank you for everybody who continues to submit questions. Chris, I think one of the first things we should address is quite a few of the questions relate to the number of respondents about the survey, and just a little bit of background about like the demographics of the survey, what we're able to share about that.
Yeah, so apologies, I got some weird lighting coming in, so it's some mid-December sun. I'll take it here in Iowa, but if I have a shadow, that's why. Yeah, we looked at the survey respondents, those that participated, and like I said in the video that we shared, we're not at liberty to say who all participated. What we did look at is between Lori and team at NGA and ourselves, Industry Knowledge. We think that we captured about 30% of the manufacturing volume in the residential fenestration market. So, you know, obviously, some of the larger players did participate in that, and so we do think that it's overall generally representative of the industry. So we think that we did get a good capture of that industry. We will be releasing the next survey probably in the January timeframe, asking about Q4 conditions, then overall 2024 and beyond market outlook. So we've got the QR code scanned here on the screen. If you'd like to participate, we would more than welcome that. And we are anticipating higher participation. So, you know, we do, obviously, the more participants we can get, the better. But as far as this last survey goes, we think it's captured about 30% of the industry. So from a survey perspective, pretty statistically significant.
Thank you. Do we have any information about how much reduction in window square foot per home is speculated?
With regard to, like, so if you think about the different styles of homes, from entry-level production to move up luxury custom homes, one of the things that, so we didn't specifically ask like how many units how many fewer units, if any, are going to be in production homes. We don't think that that's going to be a huge difference. We did, after, so this presentation, the video that we watched was at Glassbuild on October 31st. Since that time, we had a survey with custom residential architects, and we specifically asked around window usage, more openings, fewer openings, bigger units, smaller units. And what the respondents overwhelmingly came back and said, you know, about the same number of units, maybe a few units more in homes. And then obviously this trend for bigger window units is also sticking. I saw there's a question in the Q&A about large openings and if we expect that trend to continue. And the answer is yes, we do expect that trend to continue as well. So I think as far as entry-level production, it's not going to be a huge downgrade in the number of openings, number of units. And then on the move up luxury custom home side, we don't anticipate any fewer units or openings.
Thank you. We have a handful of questions also related to triples and energy efficiency in general. Will thin triple insulated glass units gain interest among window and door manufacturers in 2024 as a viable way to achieve Energy Star 7.0 certification?
That is a good question. I think several manufacturers are actually banking on that happening. So, you know, that is potentially, you know, I'm not an energy scientist or a building scientist. So, you know, with regard to the specifications of, you know, how to achieve that through thin triples, that is certainly a focus area. So a lot of our consumer research has also shown that homeowner demand is there for energy efficiency and energy improvement. You know, whether it be manifested in triple glazing or other means, you know, it's that balance, like similar to the tax credits from the IRA and cost versus benefit. So, you know, that's obviously a balancing act. We think that affordability is still top of mind, and the price increases, and, you know, how much this technology costs to achieve some of these ratings. It's definitely a balance that we think is going to be prevalent for a couple of years yet. But certainly twin triples, and we are starting to see evidence of that showing up, but not just in necessarily the northern climates, but also in some of the regions where you think that it may not be applicable, but we are starting to see that show up more.
And do you have data about what percentage of the IG market is triple pane?
I don't off the top of my head. I can follow up with you later, and we can. I know there's a couple studies that show that. I don't have it off the top of my head though, but we can follow up.
Thank you. And one of the other attendees submitted a question about, will builders upsell windows to Energy Star 7?
We've started to see that, again, similar to the previous question around, this balancing act between affordability and consumer demand and consumer desires versus affordability. So, a lot of the things that I talked about, the builders are saying, they're having to they're downgrading potentially materials to balance affordability. We see a lot of this driven in from homeowner demand, homeowner pull through, but more significantly, what we're seeing is with regard to energy efficiency is code changes seem to be the #1 driver. So if you have, like, there's been a couple of states that have come out and said every new residential home has to be Energy Star. I think Colorado is one of those states that's mandating that. So we're starting to see that in other areas too. I was talking to a dealer a few weeks ago in the Kansas City area, and they said they've really upped those code changes, the code requirements for energy efficiency. So we think that's going to be a stronger driver. I will say that I've talked to several builders too over the past 6 months and really understanding how they're trying to get their arms around these energy efficiency requirements. Is it more insulation? Is it spray foam versus fiberglass? How does the exterior sheathing come into play? How do windows and doors come into play? So I think it's a mixture of builders, what the builders want to do from an affordability standpoint, but then also what is being pulled through from the homeowner, and then probably even more impactful is the code changes that we're seeing around the country. I think you're on mute, Lori.
Jumping over to labor, the statistics around that are just astounding with a 20% labor cost jump. Do you anticipate that is going to repeat in 2024?
I hope not. Put it that way, because it was so impactful in margins and bottom lines. So one of the things that I do at John Burns too is I monitor the publicly traded building products companies, and really across the board, we're seeing this in the job numbers that come out too. We're still seeing labor inflation, not to the extent of 20%. So we're not seeing that. Obviously, as the job market is cooling, it's still strong, but it has cooled a little bit. We're seeing less pressure on wages. Certainly, better inflation numbers are helping with that too. So the job hopping, we're not seeing that as prevalent as from a national perspective as far as labor is concerned. So I don't anticipate that 20% to continue next year.
We all hope it doesn't. Now, one of the questions is, how do you think this data will affect those contemplating selling their business? Do you think 2024 and 2025 are prime years to sell or buy a competitor?
That's a good question. So we don't get into, at least in my role, we don't get into specific deals on the research side at John Burns, but there certainly is a lot of interest in the industry. We saw things kind of slow down last year, at the end of last year, with the uncertain macro that we were facing in 2023. The results of the survey kind of speak to back to a normal return to growth. Whether it's an opportunistic time for business owners to say, I'm going to get out, I'm going to cash out. We are still seeing pretty strong multiples in the deals that do come across, not necessarily just specific to windows and doors, but in building products in general too. So, I think that's up to each buyer and or seller as to what the multiples shake out to be. We have our projections on growth. We think that relatively flat growth in 2024. But then, as I mentioned, the upside, due to the housing shortage, due to the primary modeling years, the upside over the next several years is very positive. So we think there are definitely tailwinds past 2024.
Sure. One attendee comments that multifamily does not seem to be slowing in the DC metro area. Did the survey take into account respondents in metropolitan areas? Metro areas do not have enough multifamily for demand. And then relating to the regionality of that question, another question does ask specifically if we have any regional nuances for 2024 growth projections.
We, specific to the window and door industry and this survey, we don't have any regional cuts. We hope to achieve that, when we get a bigger base in the coming year. With regard to regionality, from a new construction and R&R perspective, we do see stronger growth in new construction in kind of the Sunbelt regions that we've seen. So, Southeast, we're actually seeing pretty significant growth in California right now too. Florida has remained strong. Florida's coming off a pretty high base because it stayed relatively stronger for longer in the new construction downturn that we saw at the beginning of this year. From an R&R perspective, you think about those pockets of growth of new homes that we saw in the early 2000s, where those homes are 20, 25 years old now and coming into that prime remodeling age. Interestingly, we did a study in our quarterly building products analysis and forecast early this year where we specifically looked at R&R. And contrary to what our thinking was, we're actually seeing the lowest growth in the Northeast. When you think about the Northeast, it's got the oldest homes, generally speaking, and you think that there's stronger R&R, but what we're seeing there is those homes have kind of already gone through that wave of remodeling. So we're seeing actually stronger growth in kind of that mid-Atlantic, Midwest, and even in the Southeast to an extent in the Northwest too, from a percentage standpoint. We can follow up with our regional cuts on that. So if we want to collect the information, and we can follow up with some of that information.
Now, a couple people have made comments about both Energy Star 7.0 and the Inflation Reduction Act. One of the questions is related to the last incentive. Was the industry pessimistic at that time as well? And also related to the IRA, was the pessimism for wood and vinyl window suppliers?
I'm not sure of the pessimism or skepticism, if you will, on the 2009, 2010 timeframe. Like, trying to recall back to if manufacturers thought that was going to be impactful or not. I do know there's been a few comments in the Q&A, and I've heard this from others I've talked to too. Yes, the incentives are vastly different. They're significantly smaller. The cost of window units is up significantly from that time frame, proportionate to today's costs. What I like to say is, the IRA, A, homeowner awareness is pretty low. B, the requirements to achieve are still pretty high. I know the industry is kind of lobbying to get some of these requirements taken down, and to some extent, the EPA has agreed to take some of the requirements down, especially in the southern regions. But what I would say is the IRA is certainly not going to be a headwind. So there will be some lift, whether it's as impactful as it was in the 09-10 timeframe remains to be seen, but it certainly is not a headwind. And so anything manufacturers, installers can do to get ahead of that, increase homeowner awareness of that, to kind of drive some of that demand, we think that net it will be positive for the industry.
And does John Burns research and consulting have a take about how the national election might affect the market?
No, it's always unpredictable. It seems like every election cycle seems to become more polarizing anyway. So, what we tend to just focus on is the macro and what we're seeing. One of the things a lot of the macro environment that I talked about at the end of October has changed significantly since that time frame. So inflation numbers that came out earlier this week, more positive. The Fed really, I was actually rather surprised to see that they're penciling in 3 rate cuts next year. It doesn't mean they're going to do that, but earlier in the October timeframe, we're like, well, maybe rates will come down mid next year. And so the Fed, for Jerome Powell yesterday, to explicitly say, like, yeah, we're penciling in 3 rate cuts next year. I think that's going to be more of a tailwind to the industry, probably outweighing any impact that a presidential election year may bring.
Thank you. We are running short on time, so we'll just do one more quick question, and that is actually relating a little bit back to the demographics and the specifics of the survey. But we had one attendee wonder if it's possible to suggest questions to the survey, and thank you. Yes, we always welcome suggestions. And specifically, the question is, I'm wondering what product sales look like if specific things are trending up or down. For example, are people leaning toward using more or less wood, more or less aluminum, etc.?
That is probably that's a good take. That I think that's something that we could add for the next survey. So yes, to echo to your response, Lori, we certainly do welcome any questions. So you can reach out to myself by contact info or to Lori directly. We'll take that into consideration for the next survey in January, February timeframe. You know, material conversion and some wood versus aluminum versus, you know, fiberglass, composite, vinyl. You know, obviously we've seen the share of vinyl continue to grow. Wood has remained relatively stable with slight declines, but then fiberglass composite is gaining share too. So, you know, that's one of the things I think we're going to ask next year too, is there any material conversion? We're not really seeing drastic moves from the side of the architects, especially in those homes that would typically have wood windows. So think about your move up luxury. We're not seeing drastic moves there, but I think that's something that's certainly an opportunity for us to ask next year.
All right, well, with that, we will wrap up today's Thirsty Thursday webinar, the last of 2023. We thank all of you for being here with us today. And hope to see you again in January. If this is your first time attending a Thirsty Thursday, we hold these fairly regularly, typically the third Thursday of the month, December being an exception. But in addition, we put in the webinar chat, recommend you visit glass.org/on-demand-webinars. That's where we post the recordings for all past Thirsty Thursdays, and that's where this recording can also be found by the end of the day tomorrow. So thank you again so much, Chris and Lori, and for everyone for spending part of your afternoon with us. We wish you a great rest of the afternoon and remainder of the year.